They told me I didn't have to sell it, but what good is white lace when the man you wore it for is gone? I stood there in the attic that morning, sunlight falling through the old wooden beams, dust swirling like slow snowflakes. The air smelled of cedar and thyme, and there it was, my wedding dress, folded neatly inside a yellowed box. I hadn't opened it in over 50 years. I thought I never would. But death changes the way you look at things, even the things you once thought you'd hold on to forever. William had been gone only 3 days. 3 days, and already the house had started to feel like someone else's. His boots still sat by the door, his hat hung on the peg, and his coffee cup, the chipped one with the blue rim, still waited beside the sink, as if he'd be back any moment. I couldn't move them, couldn't touch them. It felt like betrayal. When I lifted the lid of that old box, the air left my lungs. The dress was softer than I remembered ivory, not white anymore, delicate as a whisper. I'd sewn part of it myself, with help from my mother. The tiny pearl buttons still clung to the back, and the hem still carried a faint smudge of dirt from the day we ran laughing through the rain after the ceremony. I traced the fabric with my fingers, feeling every stitch, every heartbeat stitched into it. I could almost see myself again, 22, trembling with joy, standing before the mirror while William peeked through the doorway, pretending not to. I'd scolded him for breaking tradition, but he just smiled that crooked smile and said, "I already know you're the most beautiful thing I'll ever see, Ellie," and I believed him. That dress wasn't just cloth. It was the start of everything. The first dance, the first home, the first time we fought and made up before the sun went down. It was laughter in the kitchen and promises whispered under quilts on cold nights. It was life, our life. But now life had turned to silence. I remember sitting on the attic floor with that box open in front of me, the dress spread across my knees, and thinking, how can something that once felt so alive now feel like an anchor? How can love leave behind so much and yet take everything? The funeral director had called earlier that day. The cost was more than I'd expected. Margaret offered to help, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She has her own children, her own life. I couldn't let her bear that burden. William and I always said we'd handle things together, and even now I wanted to keep my promise. That's when my eyes went back to the dress. The thought came slow, quiet, and cruel, like a whisper you don't want to hear. You could sell it. At first I shook my head. I couldn't. It wasn't just a dress, it was a piece of him, a piece of us. But the whisper stayed, because love, no matter how deep, doesn't pay for coffins or flowers. I folded it back into the box, closed the lid, and sat there for a long time, staring, crying, remembering. The attic light dimmed as the afternoon sank into evening, and I could almost hear William's voice again, calm and sure, the way it always was. "Ellie," he used to say, "the things we keep don't keep us." He said it once when our old car broke down and I refused to let it go. I didn't understand then. I think I do now. That night I didn't sleep. I made tea I didn't drink and sat in his chair until dawn. The next morning I wrapped the dress in brown paper and tied it with the same ribbon we'd used to seal our wedding invitations. My hands shook, but I didn't stop. I placed a small note inside. For love that never fades, even when the lace does. When I walked to the little antique shop on Main Street, the air was sharp with spring wind. The woman behind the counter looked young enough to be my granddaughter. She smiled politely when I told her I wanted to sell a wedding dress. She asked if I was sure. No, I wasn't, not at all, but I nodded anyway. She lifted the fabric gently, admiring it, and said it would fetch a fair price. I only heard half her words, the rest drowned in the sound of my heartbeat. As I left, I looked back once at that dress hanging behind the glass. For a moment, I saw my reflection beside it, the old woman I've become standing next to the girl I once was. It felt like saying goodbye to both. And maybe that's what grief is, not just losing someone, but losing the version of yourself that existed when they loved you. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If the price of peace meant letting go of the last thing that held your love together, would you pay it? Because that's what I did. And I'm still not sure if it was an act of strength or surrender. The shopkeeper called 2 days later. She said the dress had sold. Her voice was kind, careful, the sort of tone people use when they know they're touching something delicate. It went to a good home, she told me. A young woman, she said it reminded her of her grandmother's gown. I murmured something polite, something that sounded like gratitude, and hung up before my voice could betray me. The house was silent again, except for the clock ticking in the kitchen. That clock, it had been a wedding gift from William's uncle. It never once kept perfect time, but William always said it didn't matter. It ticks, he used to say, and so do we. That's all that counts. Now it was just ticking for one. The money came in an envelope with the shop's name stamped across the front. I held it in my hand for a long while, unable to open it. It felt heavier than paper should. When I finally did, I saw the crisp bills, far too new for something paid for with something so old. It wasn't much, not really, just enough to cover the rest of the funeral costs. But that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was how simple it all felt, how easily the world could put a price on the thing that had once carried every promise I ever made. I used to think love left traces that could never be erased, fingerprints on your soul, invisible but eternal. But that morning, as I stood at my kitchen table counting money I'd never wanted to hold, I realized something I'd never dared to admit. Love leaves traces, yes, but so does loss. And sometimes they look the same. The funeral was quiet, too quiet. I sat in the front row, clutching the handkerchief Margaret had pressed into my palm. William's coffin was simple dark oak, polished enough to reflect the stained glass light from the church window. The pastor spoke of peace and eternity, of a love that transcends this mortal plane, but I wasn't listening. I was staring at the curve of the wood, thinking how much he'd have hated such stillness. William was never still. He was movement, laughter, humming while shaving, tapping his fingers to the rhythm of a song no one else could hear. When they lowered him into the ground, a wind swept through the cemetery, scattering cherry blossoms over the grass. One petal landed on my lap, pale pink and trembling. I kept it there until the ceremony ended, and even after everyone left, I stayed behind. "Did I do right, Will?" I whispered. "I sold the dress, paid for everything, like you'd want." The only answer was the breeze. That night, the house felt colder than before. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't strike all at once. It seeps. You think you're fine until a cup clinks too loudly or a shadow falls where it shouldn't. I sat in our living room and stared at the empty chair across from me. His slippers were still beneath it. I should have put them away, but I couldn't. Not yet. I kept telling myself that selling the dress was just a practical decision, a necessary one. But the truth? It felt like I'd traded a piece of myself for the right to say goodbye. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the funeral home. The handwriting was neat and impersonal, printed in blue ink. "We hope the service met your expectations. Please find attached your remaining balance and receipt." Enclosed with it was an envelope I didn't recognize. It wasn't from the funeral home. The handwriting was different, shaky, uncertain. For a moment, I thought maybe someone had sent condolences. But when I opened it, there was no signature, just a short message written in faded pencil. "He wanted you to know he kept the letter." I froze. What letter? My heart pounded in my chest as I unfolded the paper again, reading the words over and over. The handwriting wasn't familiar. It could have been anyone's. But something about it, the unevenness, the tremor in each curve, felt personal. William had always written letters. During our first year of marriage, he'd leave them in my sewing basket under the pillow, even tucked inside the sugar jar. Little notes that said things like, "You looked beautiful even when you burned the toast," or "Don't forget I love you at 3 p.m. too." But there was one letter I remembered most, the one I wrote him before his last hospital visit. I'd slipped it into his coat pocket, thinking he'd find it when he got cold. I told him not to worry, told him I'd be fine if anything happened. I didn't mean it, of course, but I wanted to be brave for him. Could someone have found that? Could they be telling me he'd read it before the end? I called the funeral home, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the receiver. The woman on the line sounded puzzled. She said they hadn't sent any additional correspondence, just the invoice. I thanked her and hung up, though I barely heard what she said. For the rest of that day, I wandered through the house like a ghost. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light made me wonder if I'd missed something. Maybe he'd left something behind, a note, a sign, anything. By evening, I found myself back in the attic. I hadn't been able to stay away from that empty spot where the box once sat. I knelt there, touching the bare wood floor. The dust was still disturbed from when I'd lifted the box days ago. My knees ached, but I stayed there, whispering his name like it might call him back. And that's when I saw it. A slip of paper wedged between the floorboards, half hidden by shadow. My breath caught as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded to brown. It was his handwriting. "If you ever have to sell the dress," it said, "don't feel sorry. It's just a thing. The real thing, the real us, is what you can't sell." I covered my mouth with both hands, choking on a sob. The date at the bottom, 1974. He must have written it years ago, maybe when I told him once that if times got hard, the dress would be the last thing to go. He'd laughed, kissed my forehead, and said, "Then I'll make sure you never feel guilty for doing what's right." He'd kept his word. Even from beyond the years, even beyond the grave, he'd found a way to let me go without regret. I sat there for a long time, holding that letter against my heart, and for the first time since his death, I smiled a small, broken smile, but a real one. Because maybe love doesn't end when the heartbeat stops. Maybe it lingers, waiting quietly in the cracks of old floorboards, in forgotten corners of memory, in the places where grief thinks it's alone. Before I tell you what I did next, let me ask you something. If love left you one last message, one you weren't meant to find until after goodbye, would you open it? Or would you keep it sealed, afraid of what truth might come spilling out? Because I did open it. And what I found next changed everything I thought I knew about how love and loss truly end. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried the hush of sorrow, that strange heavy quiet that follows a night of remembering. The light pushed gently through the curtains, painting pale gold over the floorboards, over the open chest, over the fragments of my past, now scattered like fallen petals. I sat where I had been all night beside the chest, with William's letter in my lap. I had read it so many times that the paper had begun to soften at the creases, and still his words pulled something new out of me each time. If love must live in memory, then I hope it finds peace in your hands. Those were the last words, not a goodbye, not a promise. Just peace, something he had spent his whole life giving, and now asked me to find on my own. My eyes wandered to the small envelope that had fallen from the folds of the letter the night before. It had gone unnoticed in my tears and trembling. My name was written on it in his careful hand, Eleanor. No darling, no sweetheart. Just my name, plain and steady, the way he used to say it when he wanted me to listen. I opened it with a kind of reverence I didn't know I still possessed. Inside was a key, old brass and small enough to fit in my palm, There was no note, no clue, just the key. I turned it over and over, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Then, as if guided by some invisible pull, I knew exactly where it belonged. The oak cabinet in the living room, the one William always kept locked. I hadn't opened it since he passed. I'd assumed there was nothing in it but papers and old invoices. My hands shook as I fitted the key into the lock. It turned easily, as though it had been waiting for me all this time. Inside, wrapped in a piece of linen, was a small wooden box, hand-carved, smooth at the corners, and faintly scented with cedar. My heart caught as I lifted it out. For a moment I didn't want to open it, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of what memories it might unravel. But then I thought of his letter, and I knew I owed it to him to see. Inside the box were things that made my breath falter. A photograph of us on our wedding day, yellowed and fading. A pressed wildflower from the field where we first kissed, and folded neatly beneath them, a small slip of paper, a receipt. For the wedding dress. It took a moment for me to understand. The date was recent. The handwriting wasn't his, it was mine. The store clerk's note scrawled across the bottom confirmed it. Purchased by Eleanor Whitman, sold for $210. I stared at it, my vision blurring. I had sold that dress weeks after his funeral. I'd told myself it was practical, that I needed to cover the costs, that sentimentality couldn't feed the living. But now, holding that receipt in my hand, I saw what he wanted me to see. The dress was never about money. It was about what it meant to us, about everything that was stitched into its lace, the laughter, the vows, the years. Under the receipt was another letter, shorter this time, written in the same gentle hand I'd know anywhere. If you ever have to let go, Ellie, make sure it's only the fabric, not the love. I never wanted you to keep the dress. I wanted you to keep what it stood for us. Selling it won't erase that. The world might measure things in dollars, but I know you. You measure in memories. My tears came quietly this time. Not the wild kind that twist your face and shake your body, but the still kind, the kind that falls softly, like forgiveness. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of his words anchoring me in a strange peace. For so long I had thought love was something you could lose, that when the body was gone, the love had nowhere left to live. But William, he'd known better. He had built a home for it in the smallest places, in letters, in old boxes, in pressed flowers, in every memory that refused to fade. That afternoon I went into the garden, the one we had planted together in our first spring as husband and wife. It had grown wild since he'd gone, ivy curling over stones, roses reaching toward the fence. I took the wooden box with me, knelt by the rose bush he'd planted for me, and buried it there, the photographs, the flower, the receipt, and all. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about returning what belonged to the earth, letting love rest where it began. When I finished, I sat on the garden bench and whispered his name into the wind. For the first time since he died, I didn't feel like I was talking to the past. I felt like I was heard. And maybe that's what love really is, not holding on, but knowing when to let the world carry it forward for you. Before I went back inside, I noticed something glinting under the rose bush, a thin silver band half buried in the soil. My breath caught again. It was my old wedding ring, the one I'd thought I'd lost years ago while tending the garden. I laughed through my tears. Of course it would be there, waiting all this time, just like him. That night, as I placed the ring back on my finger, I whispered softly, "You came back, William, just not in the way I expected." And for the first time in years, I slept without dreams, just peace. The next morning, the world felt quieter, not heavy, not empty, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when the storm has finally passed, when the air holds its breath, waiting to see what you'll do next. I woke before dawn, as I often did in those years after William's passing. The kettle's whistle sounded too loud in the silence. I poured my tea, honey, and milk just the way he liked it, and for a moment I almost set a second cup on the table. Old habits are stubborn ghosts. The garden outside shimmered with dew. His roses looked brighter somehow, their petals blushing with the new sun. I stood by the window, my hand tracing the glass, and I whispered, "You've always known how to come back, haven't you?" That was the morning I decided to go see him. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I packed a small basket. Inside it, I placed one last letter, my words to him this time, and a piece of lace I'd cut from my wedding veil. It was all I had left of the dress I'd sold. I didn't feel guilty anymore. I just wanted him to have a part of it, something that once touched us both. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town. I used to hate that hill. The climb always felt endless, cruel. But that morning, it felt lighter, like the world had softened its edges just for me. I walked slowly, each step echoing years of love, loss, laughter. The wind tugged at my shawl, playful, almost familiar. I smiled at the thought how often I'd teased William for never learning how to tie a scarf properly, always letting it fall loose in the breeze. He'd laugh, saying, "Maybe I just want the wind to remember me." I reached his grave. The grass had grown tall, dotted with wildflowers that weren't there before. Someone, maybe the groundskeeper, maybe fate, had planted lilies nearby, his favorite. I knelt down and brushed the dirt from his name. William Whitfield, beloved husband, loyal friend. "Loyal friend," I whispered, tracing the letters. They should have written "stubborn fool." You never did learn how to rest, did you? The words came easy now, not cracked by grief like before. Talking to him felt natural, as if time had folded and I was just sitting by the porch again, waiting for him to finish his stories. I took the lace from my basket, a small, delicate piece, yellowed at the edges, but still soft. I placed it gently on the stone right beneath his name. Then I unfolded the letter. My voice trembled as I read, "My dearest William, I sold the dress because I couldn't bear to see it without you in it. But I kept the love, every bit of it. You told me once that love is not meant to be kept, it's meant to be lived. So I'll live it, even now. You'll find me in the garden when the wind blows, in the laughter of our children, in the quiet tea on a cold morning. You'll find me still yours, always." The wind picked up then, just enough to lift the lace and carry it a few inches before it settled back down. I laughed softly, a tear catching the corner of my mouth. I know, you never liked goodbyes." I sat there for a long while, watching the sky change color from gold to pink to that tender shade of blue that always reminded me of his eyes. A robin landed nearby, tilting its head at me like it wanted to listen. "I used to think I'd run out of love to give," I said quietly. "But it turns out love doesn't run out, does it? It just changes form." For a moment I thought I heard his voice faint, carried by the wind, like memory wearing sound. "You finally understand." Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe, just maybe, he was there. Before I left, I placed my hand flat on the stone. "Rest easy now," I whispered. "I'll keep blooming." And with that, I turned toward home, the garden, the roses, the life still waiting. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because love, I realized, doesn't live behind us. It walks beside us, always. Nights are quieter now. Not empty, just quieter. There's a difference, you know. Empty is when something's missing. Quiet is when everything's finally said. It's been 6 months since I left that piece of lace on William's grave. 6 months since the world started feeling a little less heavy, and my home began to sound less like an echo and more like a heartbeat again. The roses he planted have grown wild, untamed the way he always loved them. I used to trim them, keep them neat, but now I let them be. Some things deserve to bloom as they please. Every morning I sit by the window with my tea, watching the petals drift to the earth like falling memories. I still set 2 cups on the table, one for me, one for him. Habit, perhaps, or faith, maybe both. The wedding dress is gone, sold, paid for a funeral that gave him rest. But every thread, every stitch still lives in my mind, stitched to the laughter we shared, the years we built, the quiet evenings when his hand found mine without a word. Sometimes I think about the young girl I was when I wore that dress, trembling, glowing, thinking forever was something that could be held. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that forever isn't a time. It's a feeling that refuses to die. I've stopped waiting for the ache to leave. It doesn't. It just changes its name. Sometimes it's called missing, sometimes remembering, and sometimes on good days it's called peace. Last night there was a storm. Rain beat against the roof like it was trying to find its way in. I lit a candle, the same one I'd burned at his funeral, and sat by the window. The smell of wet earth filled the air, and for a moment I felt him again. Not beside me, not as a shadow, but as something gentler, a feeling, a hush. I whispered, "You always said storms meant life was beginning again." And maybe it was. When the rain stopped, I stepped outside. The garden glistened, droplets like tiny lanterns clinging to the roses. The air was cool, soft, forgiving. I looked up, and the moon was peeking through the clouds, shy but steady. It reminded me of him, how he used to watch me dance under the moonlight, pretending to be embarrassed but never looking away. I smiled through the tears that always come when I remember too much. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced, slowly, carefully, barefoot on the wet grass, with the moon as my witness and the wind as my music. The world around me blurred, the roses, the fence, the candlelight from my window, all of it melted into a soft, shimmering haze. I closed my eyes and whispered, "This is for you." And for one fleeting second, I swear I felt arms around me, warm, familiar, and safe. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't need to, because love, once it finds its home, never truly leaves. It lingers in breath, in memory, in rhythm. When the wind finally stilled, I stood alone again, but not lonely. I looked up at the stars and said, "I kept my promise, William. I lived. Even after you left, I lived." The candle in the window flickered. The roses swayed, and I knew he heard me. Tonight I'll sleep with the window open, so the wind can carry his voice back if it wants to. Not because I'm waiting for it, but because I'm ready in case it does. And if it doesn't, well, that's all right too. Because I've learned something in all my years: love doesn't end. If this story touched your heart, please like and share. And don't forget to subscribe our channel, Beloved Grandma, where every memory has a heartbeat.